Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Franklin expedition, beginning our journey in the spring of 1845. Imagine, if you will, the morning of May 19th. We are standing on the banks of the River Thames at Greenhithe. The air is heavy with the scent of low tide and coal smoke, a damp, gray mist clinging to the water's surface. Two great silhouettes rise from the river, their masts reaching toward the pale English sky like dormant giants. These are the vessels of the Royal Navy, the HMS Erebus and the HMS Terror. They are not merely ships, they are the pinnacle of Victorian engineering, prepared to conquer the final piece of the world's map. Listen to the gentle lapping of the Thames against the wooden piers. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolls, signaling the start of a journey from which no one truly expected such a long silence. The ships themselves are marvels of strength. The Erebus, 378 tons, and the Terror, slightly smaller at 331 tons, were originally built as bomb vessels. Their hulls were designed to withstand the tremendous recoil of heavy mortars, making them uniquely suited for the crushing embrace of the Arctic ice. To further prepare them, shipwrights have reinforced their bows with additional layers of oak and elm, making the wooden barriers nearly 8 feet thick. Imagine the texture of that wood, seasoned and sturdy, protected by sheets of hammered iron at the waterline. Below the decks, hidden within the bowels of the timber, sit 20-horsepower steam engines. These machines, repurposed from the London and Greenwich Railway, hum with a mechanical promise of independence. They turn screw propellers that can be retracted into the hull to avoid the jagged teeth of the pack ice, a technology so new it feels like magic to the men on board. Inside these floating fortresses, there is a surprising sense of domesticity. Sir John Franklin, a man of 59 years with a kind face and a storied history of exploration, has ensured his men want for nothing. There are libraries on both ships containing over 2,000 books, ranging from technical manuals to the latest Victorian novels, intended to keep the mind sharp during the long, dark winters ahead. The officers' mess is a place of refinement, where silver spoons and forks, engraved with family crests, rest upon tables. The air below decks is kept warm by an innovative system of pipes that carry heated air, a luxury unheard of in previous voyages. It is easy to imagine the optimism that filled these cabins. The men believe they are prepared for a single season of sailing, perhaps two, before they emerge on the other side of the world as heroes of the Northwest Passage. The pantry is a testament to the scale of the endeavor. 8,000 tins of preserved meats and vegetables, sealed with the latest technology by Stephen Goldner, are stacked high in the holds. There are mountains of chocolate, gallons of lemon juice to ward off scurvy, and enough flour and salt beef to last 3 full years. In these early days, the sheer volume of supplies feels like an absolute shield against the elements. 134 men originally set out, a vibrant community of sailors, marines, and scientists. As the ships move through the North Sea and toward the Orkney Islands, the mood remains light. They stop at Stromness to take on fresh water and the final bits of local produce, the sailors writing letters home filled with confidence. They speak of the beauty of the coast and the camaraderie that is already forming between the crews of the two ships. By July, the expedition reaches the Whalefish Islands in Disco Bay, off the coast of Greenland. This is the last outpost of the familiar. The transport ship, the Barretto Jr., alongside the HMS Rattler, helps transfer the final stores to the Erebus and Terror. It is a busy, bustling scene against a backdrop of towering icebergs and the stark, rocky shores of the north. It is here that the final letters are written. 5 men, deemed unfit for the rigorous journey ahead due to illness or personal reasons, are sent back to England, reducing the total complement to 129 souls. One lieutenant writes to his sister, telling her not to give them up if they go silent for a year or two. He speaks of the long blank that must now exist in their correspondence. As the supply ships turn back toward the east, the Erebus and Terror are left alone, two small specks of black and yellow against the sapphire water and the blinding white of the glaciers. In late July 1845, two whaling vessels, the Prince of Wales and the Enterprise, are working the waters of Baffin Bay. Through the shifting fog, they spot the Franklin ships. The Erebus and Terror are moored to an iceberg, waiting for a break in the pack ice to enter Lancaster Sound. The whalers report that all seems well. Captain Dannett of the Prince of Wales is even invited to dine with the officers, though the weather prevents the meeting. Instead, they exchange waves across the water. This is the last time any European will see the 129 men alive. As the whalers watch, the two ships cast off from the ice and begin to move westward. The sun, which barely sets in these northern latitudes during the summer, casts a long, golden light across the hulls. Slowly, the Erebus and the Terror sail into the mouth of the Sound, the white mist of the Arctic closing like a curtain behind them. The sound of the wind is the only thing that remains, a soft, cold whistle that carries the ships into the unknown of 1848 and beyond. Close your eyes now and listen to that wind as the world fades to white. After the whalers vanished into the horizon in late July 1845, the Erebus and Terror turned their prows toward the unknown reaches of Lancaster Sound. There was a sense of profound stillness as the ships cut through the dark, frigid waters. The men watched the jagged, snow-dusted cliffs of Baffin Island slide past, their hearts full of the Victorian dream of discovery. Sir John Franklin, a man of nearly 60 years, stood on the deck, breathing in the biting air. They were well provisioned, carrying enough food to last 3 years, including thousands of tins of soup and meat. The steam heating systems hummed deep within the bowels of the ships, providing a sense of security against the encroaching cold. They were entering a world of white and blue. As the short Arctic summer faded, the expedition sought shelter for their first winter at Beechey Island. The ships were nudged into a quiet harbor, and the ice soon reached out to embrace them, locking the hulls in a solid, unmoving floor. Life became a series of measured routines. The men established a winter camp on the shore, building a workshop and even a small observatory to measure the flickering magnetic mysteries of the North. They spent their days reading from the vast library of 1,200 volumes or performing theatrical plays to ward off the creeping gloom. But even in this early stage, the Arctic claimed its first victims. 3 young sailors, John Torrington, William Brain, and John Hartnell, perished from illness. They were buried in the frozen ground, their headstones standing as lonely sentinels. When the sun returned in the spring of 1846, the ice softened enough for the ships to break free. There was a renewed surge of hope as they sailed south through Peel Sound, a waterway that promised a path toward the Pacific. The Victorian archipelago opened before them like a labyrinth of stone and frost. The crews worked tirelessly, navigating through drifting floes and narrow channels, searching for the lead of open water that would lead them to glory. The air was filled with the sound of snapping canvas and the calls of sailors echoing off the high, desolate cliffs. They were moving deeper into the heart of the frozen maze, unaware that the ice was preparing a permanent trap. By September 12, 1846, the luck of the expedition ran out. Near the northwest coast of King William Island, in the treacherous waters of Victoria Strait, the pack ice began to churn and thicken with alarming speed. The Erebus and Terror were no longer cutting through the water. They were being squeezed. Large floes, driven by relentless winds and currents from the north, piled against one another, creating massive pressure ridges that towered over the ships. The ice here was not the thin, seasonal coating of the previous winter, but a multi-year mass of iron-hard frozen sea. On that fateful September day, the movement ceased. The ships came to a definitive halt, held fast in a frozen desert that stretched forever. They were now at the mercy of the North. The silence of the Arctic was replaced by what the explorers called the Devil's Symphony. Beneath the decks, the men lived within a constant, harrowing soundscape. The massive oak timbers of the hulls groaned and shrieked under the immense pressure of the pack ice. It was a sound like the slow crushing of 1,000 houses, a cacophony of rumbles and sharp, gunshot-like cracks that echoed through the cabins. The iron plating at the bows shivered as the ice ground against it, creating a high-pitched whine that vibrated through the very bones of the crew. At night, lying in their bunks, the sailors could hear the ice whispering against the wood, a relentless, grinding force that never slept. They were suspended in a world of groaning metal and splintering frost, waiting to see if the ships would hold or be crushed like eggshells in a giant's fist. The second winter, from 1846 into 1847, brought a crushing sense of isolation. The sun dipped below the horizon in late autumn and did not return for months, leaving the expedition in a world of eternal twilight and brilliant, uncaring stars. The temperatures plummeted to 40 and 50 degrees below zero. Inside the ships, the internal heating struggled to keep the frost from creeping across the interior walls. Condensation from the men's breath turned to ice on the ceilings, occasionally dripping down like frozen rain. They were nearly 12 miles from the nearest shore, separated from King William Island by a jagged, impassable sea of frozen waves. As the months dragged on, the initial excitement of the voyage began to sour. The men huddled around stoves, their faces pale in the flickering oil lamps, listening to the wind howl across the masts of their wooden prisons. As May of 1847 arrived, the light returned to the high Arctic with a persistence that should have been comforting. The sun, having spent months below the horizon, began to circle the sky in a slow, unending loop, casting a pale glow over the pressure ridges of the Victoria Strait. On the decks of the Erebus, the men emerged from their winter cabins, squinting against the brilliance of the snow. There was an expectant hush among the crew. In every previous expedition, this was the season of liberation, the time when the iron-hard grip of the ice would begin to soften. They watched the horizon with a desperate hunger for the sight of open water, a promise that they might finally push through the final unknown miles of the Northwest Passage. But the liberation they prayed for did not come. Instead, a profound silence settled over the expedition, one that had nothing to do with the wind or the ice. On the 11th of June, 1847, the heart of the journey stopped beating. Sir John Franklin, the veteran explorer who had led them into these white wastes, passed away at the age of 61. He died in his cabin aboard the Erebus, surrounded by the creaking timbers and the damp chill of the vessel he had commanded with such optimism. There was no churchyard for him, no soil in which to rest. Historians believe he was buried beneath the ice. With his departure, the paternal warmth of the expedition was gone, leaving an empty captain's chair that no one felt ready to fill. The great cabin on the Erebus became a place of shadows. Imagine the scene, the fine mahogany table where the officers had shared so many hopeful dinners, now dominated by an absence. The chair at the head of the table remained, its velvet upholstery worn, a constant reminder of the weight of the task ahead. The air in the cabin was thick with the scent of coal smoke and the faint, metallic tang of the spirit lamps. Maps were still spread across the desk, marked with the progress they had made through the Arctic islands, but the ink seemed to have dried at the very moment their momentum stalled. Outside, the ice remained an unyielding, crystalline desert, stretching for miles in every direction, locking the ships into a frozen embrace. Command now fell to two men with very different burdens. Captain Francis Crozier of the Terror took overall leadership of the expedition, while Captain James Fitzjames assumed command of the Erebus. Crozier was a veteran of the Antarctic, a man who had seen the frozen walls of the South and understood the psychological toll of isolation better than anyone. He was a man of quiet competence, often prone to a deep melancholy. Fitzjames, by contrast, was younger, a man who had tried to keep the men's spirits high with theatricals and games during the long winter nights. Now, they were forced to coordinate a strategy for a summer that refused to arrive. They searched for any sign of a lead, but the reports were always the same. The ice was 10 feet thick. By August of 1847, the reality was undeniable. The expected thaw had failed. In a normal year, the heat of the summer sun would have turned the frozen strait into a mosaic of blue and white, allowing the ships to navigate the gaps. But this was not a normal year. The temperature hovered stubbornly near freezing, and the ice blink, the white reflection of the ice against the clouds, remained a permanent fixture on the horizon. The men watched the sky with aching eyes, but the dark smudges that signaled open sea never appeared. The ships remained beset, exactly where they had been since September of 1846. The sound of the wind through the rigging became a constant howl, and the groaning of the ships' hulls under the pressure was a jarring reminder of their vulnerability. As the light began to fail in September, the morale of the 129 men began to erode. They had already spent 2 winters in the ice, and the prospect of a third was a crushing weight. The health of the crew, which had held up well during the first year, was now beginning to show cracks. Subtle signs of scurvy appeared in the pale gums and bruised limbs of the sailors. Unknown to them, the tins of preserved food were potentially leaching lead into their systems, clouding their minds and weakening their bodies. The transition from an expedition of discovery to a desperate fight for survival had begun. They turned their focus inward, sealing the hatches and preparing the stoves for another season of darkness, while the empty chair watched over a crew realizing they might never return. The winter of 1847 into 1848 would be the longest yet. The sense of adventure that had characterized their departure from Greenhithe 3 years earlier had been replaced by a grim, mechanical determination to endure. Crozier and Fitzjames worked tirelessly to maintain order, but the silence between them grew as they looked at the dwindling supplies and the growing list of the sick. The Victory Point note, which would eventually tell their story to the world, would later record that by this time, 9 officers and 15 men had perished. Each death was a blow to the collective soul of the expedition. As the sun dipped below the horizon for the final time that year, the Erebus sat motionless in the dark, a ghost ship in waiting, as the ice continued to thicken around her wooden walls. The spring of 1848 did not arrive with the song of birds or the scent of damp earth. In the high Arctic, April is a deceptive season. The sun returns, hanging low and pale against a sky the color of a bruised plum, but it offers no warmth to the men trapped within the iron-hard grip of Victoria Strait. For 585 days, the ships had been motionless. The hulls of the Erebus and the Terror, once the pride of the Royal Navy, were now little more than wooden islands in a vast, white desert. The men watched the horizon every morning, hoping for the dark, jagged lines of open water that would signal their release. But the ice remained solid, an unyielding plain of pressure ridges and frozen hummocks that stretched as far as the eye could see. The realization was beginning to settle into their bones, colder even than the wind. The ships were never going to be freed. They were no longer explorers, they were prisoners of the frost. Below decks, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of damp wool, coal smoke, and the lingering, metallic tang of sickness. The internal steam heating systems, once a marvel of modern engineering, could no longer hold back the creeping frost that climbed the interior beams like white ivy. Captain Francis Crozier, an Irishman of immense experience and quiet resolve, now carried the full weight of the expedition on his shoulders. Sir John Franklin had been dead for nearly a year, having passed in June of 1847. In the time since, the command had shifted, and the hope that had once fueled their journey had slowly eroded. Crozier walked the narrow corridors of the Terror, his boots clicking softly on the floorboards. He looked into the hollow eyes of his crew. 105 men remained. 24 others, including 9 officers and 15 seamen, had already been committed to the icy earth or the deep leads in the ice. The strength of the survivors was waning, stolen by the slow, invisible theft of scurvy and the suspected poison lurking within their very rations. On the 22nd of April, 1848, the order was finally given. It was a decision of absolute necessity, a desperate gamble against the certainty of starvation. They would abandon the ships. Imagine the sound of that final morning. The scratching of a pen as Captains Crozier and Fitzjames added a frantic, marginal note to a document left in a stone cairn at Victory Point. This paper, a standard Admiralty form, had originally been deposited a year earlier with the optimistic words, "All well." Now, the ink was dark and the message was grim. They wrote of the abandonment, the date of Sir John's death, and their intention to march toward the Back River on the Canadian mainland. Every word was a heavy admission that the sea had won. They left the ships behind, those great vessels that had been their only shelter in the wilderness, and stepped out onto the shifting, treacherous floes. The march was not a simple walk. It was a grueling, agonizing labor. They did not travel light. Strapped to massive wooden sledges were the ship's heavy lifeboats, filled with thousands of pounds of supplies, personal effects, and even silver plate, relics of a civilization that felt a world away. These men, emaciated and weak, threw their weight into the leather harnesses, their boots slipping on the slick ice as they hauled the dead weight of the boats. The sound was rhythmic and haunting. The crunch of snow, the heavy breathing of exhausted lungs, and the low groan of the sledges. Every mile was a victory bought with sweat that froze instantly against their skin. They were heading south, toward a river hundreds of miles away, across a landscape that offered no shelter and no mercy. The wind howled through the rigging of the empty ships they left behind, a lonely requiem for the grand dream of the Northwest Passage. As the silhouettes of the Erebus and the Terror faded into the white haze of the distance, the men of the Franklin expedition became ghosts in their own time. They moved slowly, a long line of dark figures against the blinding white, pulling their heavy burdens toward a mainland they could not yet see. The breaking point had passed. They had traded the safety of the hulls for the freedom of the ice, but it was a freedom that carried the scent of mortality. The ice beneath their feet was a shifting, groaning giant, liable to crack and swallow them at any moment. Yet they pulled. They pulled for the memory of the wives and children waiting in England. They pulled for the honor of the service. And they pulled because, in the heart of the Arctic, to stop moving was to become part of the ice forever. The journey south had begun, but the shadows were growing longer, and the strength of 105 souls was beginning to flicker like a candle in a rising gale. Imagine the gray, fractured limestone of King William Island. It is a place where the earth seems to have forgotten the sun. In May of 1859, a man named William Hobson stood upon this shore. The wind here whispers through the cracks in the stones, carrying the ghosts of 1,000 failed breaths. Hobson's eyes caught a pile of stones, a cairn, standing like a monument against the white. He pulled the rocks away, his gloved hands cold, until he found a rusted tin cylinder. Inside lay the only written truth of the Franklin expedition, a single piece of paper known as the Victory Point Record. The cylinder was weathered, its metal skin pitted by over a decade of Arctic salt. When opened, a single sheet of paper was revealed, a standard Admiralty form, pre-printed in London. These forms were meant to be beacons, left so searchers might follow a trail. This particular sheet was fragile, stained with patches of reddish-brown rust where the metal had wept onto the cellulose. The paper felt thin, almost translucent, as if the very air of the north had tried to dissolve the evidence. Every fold was a fragile seam of history, holding onto secrets for 11 long years. Looking at the center of the page, the ink reveals a different time. It was May 28, 1847. The handwriting is steady and clear, penned by Lieutenant Graham Gore. It tells a story of triumph. It speaks of wintering at Beechey Island and navigating the Wellington Channel. At the very bottom, 2 words stand out in their simplicity: all well. In that moment, the men believed they were on the cusp of the passage. Sir John Franklin was still in command, the ships were secure, and the spirit of the crew was unbroken. The ink is dark and confident. But then the eye is drawn to the margins. There is no more space in the center, so new words crawl around the edges in a tight, frantic scrawl. The date is April 25, 1848, nearly 1 year later. The tone has shifted to a cold desperation. This second message was written by Captains James Fitzjames and Francis Crozier. The handwriting is smaller now, cramped, as if the cold had stiffened their fingers. These marks are the last official record, a frantic amendment to a story that had turned into a nightmare of ice. The most devastating line is tucked into the upper margin. It states that Sir John Franklin died on the 11th of June, 1847. This means that only 2 weeks after the first message declared all well, the leader was gone. No cause of death is given. No description of his burial, just the date and the finality. It is a haunting revelation. The crew had been leaderless for nearly a year by the time they reached this cairn. The weight of that loss must have hung over the ships like the very ice that held them fast. The toll of the Arctic winter is laid bare in the numbers. 9 officers and 15 men were already dead. Historians wonder why the officer death rate was so high, nearly double that of the sailors. Perhaps they shared more of the tainted tinned food, or the burden of leadership wore them down. The ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, were deserted on the 22nd of April, 1848. They had been trapped for 19 months, 5 leagues to the northwest. The men were now homeless on the ice, standing on the edge of a world that did not want them. The final words are the most chilling. Signed by Captain Crozier, they state, and start on tomorrow, 26th, for Back's Fish River. 105 survivors were preparing to walk. They were leaving the safety of their wooden walls to trek across the jagged ice and frozen tundra. They were planning to pull heavy lifeboats on sledges, laden with silver plate and heavy coats, remnants of a civilization with no place here. The start tomorrow was not a march toward victory, but a final, desperate gamble for survival against odds that were already stacked against every soul. This paper is all that remains of their voices. As Hobson held the record in the freezing wind of 1859, he looked at the end of an era. The rust stains and the frantic handwriting tell of a tragedy words could barely contain. The men are gone, but their message remains, a fragile testament to endurance. The record was placed back into its metal shell to return home, follow them into the white. The ships were no longer homes. They had become wooden tombs, calcified by 2 long winters of unrelenting frost that had crept into every seam of their hulls. On the 22nd of April, 1848, the order was given to abandon the only islands of warmth in a frozen sea. 105 men, their faces etched with the pale, sickly yellow of scurvy and the deep weariness of the long, dark months, stepped onto the unyielding surface of the Victoria Strait. Behind them, the Erebus and the Terror stood like skeletal monuments, their masts reaching toward a pale, indifferent sky. For over 500 days, these vessels had been their entire universe, providing the rhythmic hum of a steam engine and the smoky scent of coal fires. Now there was only the biting, sharp taste of the wind. The transition from the wooden deck to the ice was a crossing into a different kind of reality, where the walls no longer offered protection. The primary burden of their escape rested on the heavy, cumbersome sledges. These were not the light, agile sleds utilized by the Inuit, but massive constructions of seasoned oak and iron. Atop these frames sat the heavy lifeboats, their hulls painstakingly shaved down by the carpenters to save every possible ounce of weight, yet they still weighed thousands of pounds. Inside these boats, the men had packed the strange, heavy remnants of their lives. There were canisters of black tea, dense blocks of chocolate, and even the heavy silver plate from the officers' mess, objects of civilization that felt increasingly absurd in this wilderness. The sound of the iron-shod runners against the crystalline, wind-hardened snow was a low, mournful groan that vibrated through the soles of every man's boots. They leaned into the leather harnesses, their bodies tilted forward at impossible angles, desperate to find purchase on the slick, treacherous surface. Every inch of forward motion was a victory won with trembling muscles. The ice was not a smooth, marble plain, but a chaotic and violent landscape of pressure ridges and hummocks. These were the jagged teeth of the Arctic, formed where the massive floes had collided and buckled upward into frozen walls. To a man dragging a sledge, a ridge only 5 feet high was a mountain to be conquered. They could not simply walk. They had to heave, lift, and often dismantle their entire loads to pass through these frozen barricades. The light played cruel tricks on their eyes, the low sun reflecting off the white peaks with a brilliance that caused a searing, throbbing ache behind their temples. In the valleys between the ridges, the snow was deep and powdery, swallowing their legs to the knee and acting like sand against the runners of the sledges. They were moving across the graveyard of a hidden ocean, where the water had turned to stone. The ships were silent now, but the ice was alive. The physical toll was immediate and devastating. Scurvy, the silent passenger of the expedition, had begun to claim the strength of the crew long before they ever set foot on the ice. Their gums were swollen, their teeth loose in their sockets, and their legs were mapped with the dark, bruised blossoms of internal bleeding that the sailors called the black leg. Every single step was a sharp, biting reminder of their mortality. The skin on their faces was cracked and bleeding from the constant assault of the wind, and the deep cold seeped into their joints until they felt as fragile as glass. Captain Crozier and Captain Fitzjames walked among them, their own voices hushed and strained as they offered words of encouragement that felt as thin as the air. The rhythm of the march was agonizingly slow. Perhaps only a few miles were gained each day. They were a line of ghosts, 105 shadows stretching across the ice. As the blue evening fell on those first few days of the march, the silence of the Arctic became absolute. Without the familiar creak of the ship's timbers or the clatter of life on the mess deck, the world felt cavernous and empty. They would huddle together in small tents, the thin canvas providing little more than a psychological barrier against the freezing void outside. The sound of the wind, snapping the fabric, was the only music they had left. They thought of the warmth they had left behind, the glowing iron stoves and the shared stories told over hot mugs of grog. But there was no turning back to the Leviathans. The decision had been made in the margins of a single piece of paper, a note left in a stone cairn for a future that seemed to be fading away. They were committed to the ice, to the long haul toward the Great Fish River. The wind across the west coast of King William Island does not merely blow, it carves. It shapes the snow into frozen waves that hide the secrets of the dead for decades. In May of 1859, long after the world had stopped listening for the voices of the lost, a man named William Hobson saw something that did not belong to the natural landscape. Protruding from a drift in the middle of a wide, desolate stretch of Erebus Bay was a wooden stanchion, a slender finger of oak pointing toward the gray sky. As his party began to clear away the accumulation of 11 winters, a shape emerged that chilled them more than the Arctic gale. It was a lifeboat, 28 feet in length, resting not on water, but upon a massive, iron-shod sledge. It sat there like a ghost ship on a frozen sea, a monument to a struggle that had ended in total, crushing silence. When the searchers finally cleared the snow from the interior of the boat, they were met with a sight that defied logic. This was a vessel designed for survival, for the desperate flight of men who had abandoned their ships and were marching for their lives. Yet inside, the floor was littered with what Captain McClintock would later describe as a mere accumulation of dead weight. There were no stacks of salted meat or barrels of fresh water. Instead, the searchers found silver spoons and forks, many of them bearing the ornate crests of the officers. There were heavy silver handles, silk handkerchiefs of black and white and every color imaginable, and even scented soap. In the middle of a wasteland, where every ounce of weight was a step closer to the grave, these men had chosen to drag the luxuries of a London dining room across the jagged ice. The sheer physicality of what they were doing is staggering to contemplate. The boat itself weighed approximately 700 or 800 pounds, but the sledge beneath it was a monster of oak and iron. It was 23 feet 4 inches long, constructed from heavy planks that alone weighed another 650 pounds. When you add the weight of the boat, the equipment, and the surreal cargo of silver and books, these men were man-hauling nearly 1,500 pounds. The drag ropes were made of thick whale line, 2 3/4 inches in diameter. Imagine the strain on bodies already hollowed out by scurvy and lead poisoning. Each foot gained was a victory of the will over the failing flesh, a slow, agonizing crawl through a world that wanted them gone. Among the silver and the heavy iron boots, the searchers found a small collection of books. These were not survival manuals or charts of the coast. They were works of devotion and literature. A copy of the Vicar of Wakefield lay near a volume titled Christian Melodies. There was a New Testament, its pages perhaps once turned by frost-bitten fingers seeking some scrap of meaning in the white void. The presence of these books suggests a crew that was struggling to hold onto their identity, to the culture and the comforts of the world they had left behind. They were carrying the weight of their civilization with them, even as that civilization failed to provide them with the calories or the warmth they needed to see another sunrise. But the most haunting discovery lay within the boat's hull. 2 skeletons remained at their posts. One was found in the stern, wrapped carefully in a pile of furs, as if he had simply laid down to rest and never woken up. The other was found in the bow, a larger, strongly made man. Beside them lay 2 double-barreled guns, loaded and capped, leaning against the gunwale as if waiting for an enemy that never appeared. The skulls were missing, a detail that would only be understood much later when other searchers arrived. These 2 men had been left behind, or perhaps they were the last ones standing, guarding a boat full of silver and memories while their comrades vanished into the fog of the southern horizon. There is a final detail about the boat place that haunts historians to this day. When Hobson and McClintock charted the position of the sledge, they realized something terrifying. The boat was not pointing south toward the Great Fish River, the destination mentioned in the final record at Victory Point. It was pointing north. It was pointing back toward the abandoned ships, Erebus and Terror. This suggests a tragic reversal. Perhaps, after miles of hauling that impossible weight, the men realized the trek was a death sentence. Maybe they were trying to return to the only home they had left, even if that home was a tomb trapped in the ice. They were backtracking, retracing their own footsteps in a desperate, circular journey that led nowhere but to the snow. As we look at the artifacts found at Erebus Bay, we see the fracturing of the Victorian mind under extreme pressure. The lead from the tin cans had likely begun to cloud their judgment, making the weight of a silver spoon seem more important than the weight of extra rations. They were caught in a dream of the past, hauling the symbols of their status across a land that recognized no rank. The boat place stands as a silent witness to that confusion. It is a place where the line between hope and madness became as thin as the silk handkerchiefs they carried. They were men of the sea, lost in a desert of ice, clinging to the objects that reminded them they were still human, even as the Arctic began to claim them piece by piece. The wind continues to howl over the gravel spit of Erebus Bay, and the remnants of the boat have long since been scattered or reclaimed by the earth. But the image of that heavy sledge, laden with silver and the dead, remains. It is the weight of expectation, the weight of a mission gone wrong, and the physical weight of a boat that would never again taste salt water. These men carried their world on their backs until they could carry it no further. Now, they are part of the silence. We leave them there, in the cold light of the midnight sun, where the path back to the ship and the path toward the river have finally become the same thing. By the late spring of 1848, the world of the HMS Erebus and Terror had shrunk to the width of a sledge runner. On the 22nd of April, 105 men stepped off their wooden homes and onto the unyielding ice of Victoria Strait. Behind them, the ship sat as silent, ironclad ghosts, locked in the same frozen grip that had held them for 19 months. The decision to abandon the vessels was a final, desperate admission that the sea would not open for them. Led by Captains Francis Crozier and James Fitzjames, the survivors began a journey that remains one of the most harrowing marches in human history. They were heading for the mouth of the Back River, a distance of over 250 miles across a landscape of limestone, gravel, and wind-scoured ridges. Each step taken on the trek was a heavy, rhythmic struggle against a clock that was already winding down for many of the crew. As they moved, an invisible rot was working through their bodies. Scurvy, the ancient enemy of the sailor, had likely taken root long before they left the ships. Without fresh vitamin C, the biological glue of the human body, collagen, begins to fail. It is a slow and haunting dissolution. In the quiet of the Arctic night, men would have felt their old wounds from years past start to soften and reopen. Scars from childhood accidents or previous naval battles began to weep as the body forgot how to keep itself together. Their gums became swollen and dark, eventually turning black and spongy, as teeth loosened in their sockets. This is the biological reality of the shore of starvation. Inuit witnesses later described seeing groups of thin men with mouths that were hard, dry, and black, a terrifying visual of the end stages of a disease that strips away the very foundation of physical strength. The weight they chose to carry was almost as punishing as the illness. They were not just walking. They were dragging massive lifeboats mounted on heavy oak sledges. These boats were loaded with thousands of pounds of supplies, but the inventory was tragically mismatched for a survival march. Search parties later found the remains of these sledges at places now known as the Boat Place, discovering heavy silver cutlery, silk handkerchiefs, scented soap, and stacks of leather-bound books. It was as if the officers were trying to drag the weight of Victorian civilization across the ice, clinging to the objects of their former lives while their strength evaporated. Each man in the harness was pulling hundreds of pounds, his boots slipping on the frozen gravel, his breath a white plume in the sub-zero air. The sheer physical tax of this labor, combined with the lack of calories and the advance of scurvy, turned the march into a slow-motion catastrophe. They followed the western coast of King William Island, a place so desolate it feels as though the earth itself has been abandoned. The ground here is a vast, flat expanse of gray stones, offering no shelter from the wind that howls across the Simpson Strait. This is the true shore of starvation. As the days bled into weeks, the line of men began to fray. One by one, those who could no longer keep pace fell behind. Inuit oral histories speak of finding men who had simply sat down in the snow to rest and never stood up again. At Erebus Bay, the evidence of this collapse is scattered in the dirt. Modern archaeological surveys in 1981 and 1992 uncovered nearly 400 human bone fragments from at least 11 individuals at a single site. These were not neat burials, but the remains of a group that had reached the limit of what the human spirit can endure before the light fades. Within these fragments lies the most controversial and heartbreaking chapter of the Franklin mystery. When Dr. John Ray first reported Inuit accounts of cannibalism in 1854, the Victorian public reacted with horror and denial. Yet the bones tell a story that cannot be silenced by decorum. Forensic analysis has revealed fine, rhythmic cut marks on approximately 1/4 of the remains, consistent with the use of metal knives for defleshing. More distressing is the evidence of what researchers call end-stage cannibalism, where bones were broken and even boiled to extract the calorie-rich marrow. In 2024, DNA analysis even identified the remains of Captain James Fitzjames himself, revealing that even the highest-ranking officers were not exempt from these desperate measures. It was a struggle for hours, for minutes of life, played out in the coldest corners of the map, where every social hierarchy and moral boundary was tested by the primal urge to survive. The remnants of the expedition eventually reached the Adelaide Peninsula, crossing the ice to a place that history has named Starvation Cove. Here, the last handful of survivors likely watched the horizon for the mouth of the Back River, which they hoped would lead them to a Hudson Bay Company outpost hundreds of miles further south. But the river was a phantom, a goal that was physically impossible for men in their condition to reach. They died with the taste of copper and salt in their mouths, huddled in tattered woolens against the relentless northern wind. The silence of the cove today is heavy with the memory of that final camp, where the fire finally went out. The march was over, and the shore had claimed everything they were. As the shadows of the Arctic night stretch across the gray stones, we leave them there, resting in the stillness of the great white silence, as the wind continues its long, low whistle over the ruins of their journey. While the physical remnants of the Franklin expedition lay scattered across the jagged rocks of Starvation Cove, the true weight of their final days was carried not in journals, but in the memories of the people who call the Arctic home. To the 19th century European mind, this region was a blank, terrifying void, a white sheet where maps went to die. But to the Netzilik hunters, the Adelaide Peninsula was a landscape filled with names, stories, and seasonal rhythms. As the spring of 1850 arrived, the wind began to carry a new and unsettling sound across the frozen reaches of Washington Bay. It was not the cracking of the ice or the cry of a lone fox, but the rhythmic, metallic rasp of wooden runners and heavy iron chains being dragged over the hard-packed snow. The hunters watched from the ridges, their eyes adjusted to the blinding glare, as a group of men appeared like ghosts rising from the white horizon. These men were unlike any the hunters had seen before. They were 40 in number, a ragged line of figures draped in heavy, dark cloth that seemed to soak up the pale Arctic light. They moved with a slow, mechanical desperation, their bodies leaning forward into the harness straps as they pulled a large ship's boat mounted on a heavy sledge. Through the eyes of the Inuit, these sailors did not look like explorers or conquerors. They looked like the walking dead. Their faces were hollow, their eyes sunken into dark pits of exhaustion, and most hauntingly, their mouths were described as being entirely black. This was the mark of advanced scurvy, where the gums turn dark and the skin loses its ability to heal. But to the witnesses, it gave the men a terrifying, supernatural appearance. They were the Kabluna, the strangers, drifting through a world they did not understand, carrying the weight of a civilization that could no longer save them. The interaction was brief and shrouded in the heavy silence of the ice. The hunters approached a crack in the floe, and for a moment, two worlds touched. One of the strangers, a man the oral histories would remember as a leader, stepped forward. He called out a greeting, Chimo, a word of peace. The Inuit offered what they could: fresh seal meat, the only thing capable of curing the sickness that was clearly rotting the men from within. But the tragedy of the expedition was hidden even in this moment of charity. The white men took the meat, but attempted to cook it using precious blubber as fuel, a practice the Inuit found foolish and wasteful in a land where every calorie was a prayer for survival. The strangers gave the hunters a knife in return, a piece of cold steel for a piece of life-giving flesh, before the two groups parted. The sailors continued their march toward the south, their boots leaving deep, staggered tracks in the salt-crusted snow. Among these figures was a man the Inuit called a gluka, which translates to the long strider. He was described as a tall man with auburn hair, someone who seemed to carry the authority of the group even as his strength failed him. Some historians believe this was Francis Crozier, the captain of the Terror, while others think it may have been James Fitzjames. Regardless of his name in the Admiralty records, in the Arctic wind, he was simply the man who kept moving. The Inuit observed Agluka and his companions with a mixture of pity and fear. They saw the men writing in small books, their fingers surely blackened by frostbite, recording words that would never be read by their families in England. They watched as the party grew smaller, day by day, as men fell in their tracks and were left behind, their dark coats becoming markers on the endless white plain of the island. By the time the next season turned, the hunters found the places where the march had truly ended. They discovered what they called the boat places, sites where the large wooden lifeboats sat abandoned, now filled with the silent remains of those who could go no further. The oral histories speak of finding boots with bones still inside them, and boxes filled with silver spoons and forks, useless treasures in a land where a needle was worth more than a crown. Most chilling were the accounts of the state of the remains. The Inuit reported seeing bones that had been sawed or broken for their marrow, a detail that the British public would reject with fury when it was later brought home. These witnesses had no reason to lie. They were simply describing the grim reality of what happens when the spirit is willing, but the flesh is starved of everything but the will to endure. For over 160 years, these stories were treated as mere folklore by Western researchers, dismissed as unreliable or confused. Yet, when the wrecks of the Erebus and the Terror were finally located in 2014 and 2016, they were found exactly where the Inuit said they would be. The memories of the hunters had preserved the truth of the expedition's final coordinates with a precision that modern technology could only hope to match. The whispers in the Arctic wind were not ghosts, after all. They were the echoes of a history that refused to be forgotten. As we look across the Adelaide Peninsula tonight, we can almost see them still. The long striders, the dark figures against the snow, pulling their heavy burdens toward a horizon they would never reach. The land remembers them, and in the silence of the north, their story continues to breathe, held steady by the people who watched them pass into the shadows of the ice. Yet, what the world saw as myth, Lady Jane Franklin saw as a map to a hidden grave. While the ice was quietly claiming the hulls of the Erebus and the Terror, a different kind of stillness settled over London. It was the year 1848, and the silence from the north was no longer a matter of slow mail. It had become a screaming absence. In the tall, narrow house on Bedford Place, the shadows seemed deeper than they were a year before. Jane had already traded her colorful silks for the heavy, light-absorbing fabrics of mourning. But hers was not a passive grief. While the Admiralty debated and the public speculated, Jane turned her home into a war room. She was surrounded by the scent of old parchment and the metallic tang of ink that never seemed to dry. Every day, the fog from the Thames would press against her windows, but her mind was thousands of miles away, tracing the jagged edges of charts that were mostly blank space. She became known as the Lady in Black, a figure moving through the gas-lit streets of Victorian London like a living reminder of a promise unkept. To the public, she was the ultimate symbol of wifely devotion, but to the bureaucrats at the Admiralty, she was a relentless and uncomfortable force. Imagine the sound of her carriage wheels on the cobblestones, a rhythmic drumming that echoed her persistence. She did not just write letters. She wove a web of influence that stretched across the Atlantic and into the heart of government. In 1849, she even wrote to the President of the United States, appealing to a common humanity that transcended borders. Her voice, soft yet unwavering, reached the ears of those who had the power to move ships. She knew that if she stopped appearing in her dark veil, the world would allow the Arctic to swallow her husband forever. The Victorian era was a time of grand narratives and tragic heroes, and the search for Franklin became the ultimate national obsession. Newspaper boys on street corners would shout the latest rumors, their voices echoing through the London smog. The public followed every search mission as if it were a serialized ghost story. The fate of the 129 men was no longer just a naval report. It was a tragedy felt in every parlor. Jane used this fervor to her advantage. When the government hesitated to fund more voyages, she opened her own purse and launched a public appeal. The response was overwhelming. Even the citizens of distant Tasmania, where John had once served as governor, sent their hard-earned coins to help. The money flowed in, destined to be converted into wood, coal, and the iron-willed men who would sail into the white void once more. Think of the ships she helped send out. There was the Prince Albert in 1850, a small vessel that felt almost fragile against the terrifying might of the pack ice. Jane would stand on the docks, her black skirts fluttering in the salt wind, watching as these men prepared to face the same monsters that had taken her John. She did not just fund these trips, she curated them. She studied the geography of the North until she was an armchair expert, her fingers tracing the routes of the Wellington Channel and the Peel Sound. She became the first woman to be awarded the Gold Medal of the Royal Geographical Society, a testament to a mind that had mapped the frozen North from a drawing room in London. The air in her study was always thick with the dust of old reports, and the faint, sweet smell of the wax seals she broke with trembling hands. By the early 1850s, the items began to trickle back, the small relics of a vanished life. Imagine Jane sitting at her desk as a heavy wooden crate is opened. Inside, wrapped in soft cloth, are the remnants of a world that once was. A silver spoon with the Franklin family crest, tarnished by the salt air. A small brass button from a naval uniform, its shine long gone. A pocket watch that had stopped at a moment no one would ever truly know. Each object was a ghost. To the sailors who found them, they were evidence. To Jane, they were pieces of her heart. She would touch the cold metal, her thumb tracing the familiar curves of her husband's possessions, and for a moment, the distance between the London fog and the Arctic ice would vanish. These were the only witnesses that could tell her what had happened in the long, dark years after 1848. But not all news was welcome. In 1854, the explorer John Ray returned with a story that threatened to shatter the heroic image Jane had worked so hard to build. He brought accounts from the Inuit of starving men, of a desperate retreat, and of the ultimate taboo of cannibalism. The Victorian public recoiled in horror, but Jane stood her ground like a fortress. She used her pen and her considerable influence to discredit Ray's report, turning the narrative back toward noble sacrifice and tragic martyrdom. To her, the truth was not found in the grim tailies of the ice, but in the character of the men she knew. She would not allow the memory of her husband to be stained by the desperation of his final hours. She remained the lady in black, a silent sentinel of his reputation and his legacy. Her final great effort came in 1857, when she purchased a steam yacht called the Fox. She placed it under the command of Francis Leopold McClintock, a man she trusted implicitly. The Fox was her last gamble, her final letter to the North. As the ship pulled away from the dock, the world watched with bated breath. For 2 long years, Jane waited in the silence she had come to know so well. Then, in 1859, the Fox returned. It brought the Victory Point note, the only written record of the expedition's fate. It confirmed that John had died on June 11, 1847. The mystery was technically solved, but for Jane, the search would never truly end. She had spent a decade looking for a man, only to find a legend that she herself had helped to create. The passage of time in the Arctic is not measured by the ticking of a clock, but by the slow movement of the pack ice and the shifting of the pale winter light. For 166 years, the fate of the Her Majesty's ship Erebus was a story told in fragments, a ghost ship of the high north existing in the memories of the Inuit and the dreams of those left behind. The ice took her in 1848, folding her into a cold, blue vault where the sun only touched the surface briefly each year. Down in the depths of the Victoria Strait, there was a silence so absolute it felt heavy, a weight of history resting quietly on the seabed. By the time the 2014 Victoria Strait expedition arrived, the search for the Franklin ships was the longest-running cold case in maritime history. The team from Parks Canada, led by researchers Ryan Harris and Jonathan Moore, brought tools the original searchers could never have envisioned. They had side scans, sonar, and remotely operated vehicles that could peer through the dark water with digital clarity. Yet, they were still at the mercy of the environment that defeated Franklin. The window of opportunity was small, just a few weeks in late August when the ice retreated. They spent countless hours staring at monitors, watching the grainy, yellow and black patterns of the seafloor scroll by in a tedious, hypnotic rhythm of waiting. Then came the morning of September 2nd, 2014. The sea was calm in the Queen Maud Gulf. As the sonar moved across the seabed in Wilmot and Crampton Bay, something different took shape on the screen. It was not a rock or a flat expanse of silt. It was a man-made silhouette with the unmistakable curves of a hull and the straight lines of a deck. The image grew, revealing the shadow of a ship standing proud of the floor, as if she were still sailing through a dream. The excitement was hushed, a breathless realization that the search was over. The ship lay in just 11 meters of water, found nearly 170 years after abandonment. When the divers first descended into the frigid, emerald water, they were met by a sight that felt like stepping back in time. The Erebus was remarkably preserved by the cold. Her timbers were still dark and solid, the copper sheathing on her hull gleaming faintly where the silt had been brushed away. The wreck rose 5 meters off the bottom, 2 stories of naval history resting in a silent graveyard. As the divers moved along the deck, they saw the remains of the ship's structures, the hatches, and the fallen masts. It was a physical bridge to the men who lived and died here. The ship was a time capsule, holding onto its secrets with a grip as tight as the frozen earth. The most resonant discovery made during that first season was the ship's bell. It was found on the deck, a heavy, bronze instrument that once signaled the passage of the hours and the changing of the watch. When the archaeologists raised it to the surface, it was the first major artifact recovered. Seeing it in the light of day for the first time in over a century was a profound moment. The bell was a voice silenced for so long, a symbol of the order that the 129 men tried to maintain. It carried the broad arrow mark and the date 1845, the year they sailed away from England with such high hopes. In the years following, more than 350 artifacts were brought up. These were not just pieces of a ship, they were personal belongings. Archaeologists found a toothbrush and a hairbrush that still had strands of human hair, an intimate connection to the crew. They found an eyeglass lens and a leather folio that might contain the faded ink of a journal. There were lieutenants' epaulets tucked away in a drawer, and ceramic plates from the mess, still stacked as if waiting for a meal. Each object was a word in a story that had been missing its ending, helping to humanize the massive tragedy and the final days of those brave sailors. The discovery of the Erebus was a confirmation of the deep knowledge of the Inuit. For generations, they told stories of a ship that sank in the shallow waters and of the men who struggled across the ice. The searchers finally listened to these oral histories, and they were the key that unlocked the location. This shared discovery created a partnership between the local guardians and the researchers. The 129 men are no longer lost to the mists. They are remembered now as explorers whose journey reached its destination in the hearts of a modern world. The story of the Erebus reminds us of the persistence of memory. As the Arctic waters wash over the wreck, the silence is filled with echoes of the past. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.